Well, my name is Michael Cady, and in the SCA, my name is Arthur of Lockehaven. You wanted to know how I became, involved with the SCA. I was one of the people that met first, I think, in Rick Cook's house, Richard Virensteed, and heard stories that he had been over to California and actually sword fought at a science fiction convention. And I knew Rick from a place called the Inner Ear out in Tempe, ASU. It was a like coffee shop, and so it was really through Rick. And when I heard they had sword fighting, that's pretty much all I had to hear. That was something I wanted to do.
Tell me about your first event that you've been to.
First event, you got to realize in those days, many things were different. So September of 1969, we were sitting around Rick Cook's bedroom talking about what is rattan, how do you actually sword fight. By December of 69, we already had our first event. So there were only a few fighter practices in between. So the first event would have been December 7th, 1969. I'd have been 19 and showed up to sword fight. I had no costume, which if you look at early photos is kind of embarrassing, but nobody had a closet full of costumes to lend out. The event was out in Scottsdale, McCormick Park, which today they call the Railroad Park, and today is very developed. And when we were there, it was nothing. It had been abandoned, and there was like one building. But that was our first event. I showed up and met Ivan of Navarre, later Ivan Dugray, my cook, and we discussed if we were going to actually sword fight, because nobody had any armor. They had a couple of helmets that everybody borrowed. The only armor I had was I came with my archery kit and used the arm guard as a bam brace. Other than that, we had these huge barrel helms. I mean, they're just monstrous, with big padding around for the neck. Nothing on elbows, nothing on knees, nothing on legs. For body, maybe a mattress pad surcoat. That was what was popular at the time. And we went out and sword fought, and I decided that's what I wanted to do. That was my first official job, was at that event, where Michael Moria, who was the seneschal, said, how would you like to be sheriff? And I said, fine, well, what does a sheriff do? And he said, I don't know, just go be sheriff. And I tell that because I think that's a lot of how the SCA was. In those days, there wasn't a handbook on how to do everything. It was like, well, what's a sheriff supposed to do? So I helped people, park cars and do that sort of thing.
What about when you got your AOA?
Well, actually, that's kind of funny because I got my AOA decades later. The SCA was very generous towards me, I would say. And April of 1970, became a belted fighter. Not too long after that, a few years after that, Laurel. Pelican years later. Pelican didn't actually exist in the early days. And then I got my AOA after that because I guess somebody figured that I hadn't actually received one. I had other things. So that was actually kind of fun. It was many years later that I got an AOA.
So you got your AOA after you got your knighthood?
After I was Duke, been King, Crown Baron, member of the Chivalry, Laurel, and Pelican, then I got my AOA.
Do you remember what year it was?
So I did it backwards. I would have to look it up. Honestly, I don't know.
You must have been pretty surprised when they called you into court.
It was, I enjoyed it. And I think I think when I was called up to court, I said something to the effect of, finally I get some recognition.
That's fantastic. What about your first crown tourney? Did you... So I believe you were at the very, very first one, right? Yeah.
We, the very first tournament, that was December of '69, Ivan won the tournament, but it wasn't for any particular office or prize or anything. The next one was for Prince, because the SCA in Berkeley had created two kingdoms kind of full grown, the East and the Middle. And Atenveldt, they didn't. We're the first kingdom. They did things a little different. They didn't want us to become a kingdom and invented the thing called barony, which there hadn't been before, so we became the first barony.
So Atenveldt's the first barony ever?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because they invented it for us. We didn't know what that meant, but it meant that we were still under them. So like when I became a belted fighter, I was a fighter of the Kingdom of the West, because Atenveldt was in the Kingdom of the West. So the first crown tournament I was at was to be Prince. And Robert Roundpounder won that one, and I won the next one. So he was the first Prince of Atenveldt, as a principality, and then I was the second. After that, he won another one. Yeah, he won the one after that also. Then it'd be about 1971, the Kingdom of the West decided that we were either big enough to be a kingdom on our own or ornery enough they wanted to get rid of us, which may have been the second. We were, gung-ho to be our own independent kingdom, and, I think part of the issue in those days was we were closer to California, so we interacted a lot more. If we'd been a kingdom off in the middle of nowhere, maybe they would have not paid as much attention to us. So the second crown tournament for Prince I won. Then the first crown tournament for King, Ironsteed won, which everybody was thrilled, because he seemed the logical person. He and Michael Amoria created the whole thing. And I remember that very well, and I won the second crown tournament.
Was there anything specific about that first real crown tournament that you remember?
Everybody was very excited about being an independent kingdom. And honestly, I think everybody was very, very happy that Rick won. He fought very hard, and it just seemed right. He was the right guy.
He was the right guy.
The first one.
For the first one.
And that turned out very good. I could explain more about the fighting and the armor if you want.
Yeah, let's hear about
because when I think of those events, I think of how different they are compared to today. But things also developed rather quickly. As I mentioned, December '69, all I had was a vambrace on an arm. We had leather gloves, but no padding to get hit. No leg armor, body armor. By the first tournament, by the first crown tournament for King, people were showing up in armor. Leather became very popular at first because it was easy. We didn't have people around who knew how to make armor. That's one of the things to understand, is that today, if you want to learn to make armor, there's a dozen guys around that can show you how to do it. Back then, there wasn't anybody. I mean, you looked at photographs in a book, There was no internet, of course. I mean, there's just very little information. So we kind of went through the same evolution in armor that I think happened in history, where you first had cloth, so you had mattress pad and that kind of thing. Then people went to the leather because it was light and you could form it. And it took a while to figure out how to form metal. I mean, I remember banging away on an anvil, you know, trying to make something like an elbow cop, and somebody now could look at it and in 2 minutes show you what to do. But back then, nobody really knew that stuff. So the armor, I would say by the second crown tournament for king or third, the armor was starting to look very different. So it was a huge advancement in a very short period of time. I had a full halberka chainmail,
Nice.
which I made, and made each ring by hand and then welded them all together.
How'd you make them by hand? Did you?
Take an iron rod, put in a vise, take 12 gauge black fence wire.
Oh, it's an old way.
And then put them all together, and then take a oxyacetylene with like a number 1 or a 0 bit. Psst, psst, psst,
Wow.
psst, till you're done. People were starting to make their own helmets and things, but even there we were using Freon cans. We found that, you know, your head would fit in them. I guess there was a different attitude, though, was that helmets weren't expected to last forever. Today you buy a good helmet, be, you know, there forever. Back then you could tell if you got hit as to whether there was a dent. So every time you got hit, you probably got a dent. But we were starting to develop the armor. So I think the very quick evolution at first. Plate armor was later, but that's just like in history. In terms of how people fought, what I would say is in the early days, everybody had a unique style. There wasn't a single way to learn to fight. Today, what I notice is somebody goes to fighter practice to learn to fight. There's kind of a standard catechism of, you know, this is how you do this, this is how you do that. That didn't exist, so we kind of made up our own. And the people, Robert Round Pounder or Richard Ironsteed or whoever was out on the field fought differently. I think we also attempted to have the weapons to react as though the weapons are real, more than I see today. So if you look at the old films, you're going to see a lot of maces, axes, huge two-handed mauls, because the idea was if you get hit with one of those, you're going to kill the guy. Today it's mostly sword and shield, because the techniques people have developed are more efficient, faster. So I think there was a different attitude about the fighting, was that we were trying to actually reproduce medieval warfare. And I think today what's happened is SCA combat has turned into its own sport.
Yeah.
That has its own style, it has its own
rules.
Yeah, so probably, that had to happen. When I first started fighting, all the rules of fighting were on one piece of paper. And a lot of the things that were on there weren't even really rules about fighting. It was, you had to be chivalrous when you're fighting.
Did it define what those things were, or just list them out?
It didn't define in the rules of the list what chivalry was, but the king could interpret it.
Okay.
So if you weren't being chivalrous, you could be kicked out. But it also included things like, you could stab with a lance, you could throw javelins, you could use a flail or a morgenstern, but not in crown lists.
So with crown, it was just sword and shield.
It wasn't required to be that, but that was more common. I think just like today, it's not always, but it's more common. But I think we had more variety of weapons, more variety of shields. Not everybody had a heater shield. There are all kinds of different things. So I think it's kind of like evolution. Is all everybody tried all this stuff, and then it kind of winnows down
Narrow
to
down.
what. And the difficulty with some of the weapons, like an axe and a mace, in actual combat they'd be very effective, but in SCA combat they don't score well. It's easier to hit the guy with a sword, and you can't have the actual mass of the mace. So it tended to be that those kind of got left by the wayside.
Were there any spears? Were spears popular?
No, in fact, it was years later before I remember seeing the 9-foot fiberglass, poles. Those were much later. One problem was even getting a stick of rattan long enough to make a spear.
Where did you get your rattan from?
Rattan runs to California.
Yep, still like that today.
People would gather money, and somebody would drive all night and get rattan and come back, and then everybody would try to get a decent piece of it. But to get a nice long straight piece of rattan for a spear, not that common in the early days. Eventually more so. But
so what did you do for padding? I know you'd mentioned carpets and mattress padding. Were those the most popular things, or were there any other techniques or tricks?
I think padding for the most part was the mattress pad or the moving van type pad. There's a few things people came up with. Richard Barnhart had a set of gauntlets that were made by hand by his wife, where they're various tubes and they're packed with cotton batting, and they were wonderful. And so my wife made a set of those for me. Those were pretty unique. There was a time before even baseball cups, where we had a melee at one of those very early events for Rear Kingdom, and I saw Duke Richard Montroyal hit in the groin and fall over and reach in and pull out a broken baseball cup.
Oh, wow.
And what's funny is we didn't even know what a baseball cup was. So everybody went, hey, maybe we better get some of these,
That might be a good idea.
So all of a sudden, but, and people would put carpeting or leather around their legs. I believe I made the first greaves down here out of leather, and then I put steel straps on them. People kind of used whatever they had around. I mean, there was no store to go to. You couldn't order it online.
No Tandy, no.
Well, Tandy did exist. Well, there's the difference is today if you go into Tandy and you ask for certain leather things, they go, oh, are you in the SCA?
Yeah, yeah.
It wasn't like that in 1969. You go into Tandy and say, well, we need something like this, but heavier. And what are you going to do with it?
Hit
We're
each
going
other.
to form it into like armor, and the guy would just stare at you like, what, like a saddle? No, it's not a saddle. It's like, okay. But that shows how the SCA has changed, where, for years, if we went into a store with costumes on, everybody got all weird, like, what's going on? Are you guys in a play? And I think nowadays, people just go, oh, they're in the SCA. Oh, are you in the SCA? Oh, I know a friend of mine does that.
Yeah.
So today it's very common. But at one time it was, people would come to the park and just stare at you, and they're not sure if they should call the police or...
Oh, they still call the police.
Yeah.
The police actually usually show up and pose in pictures or something. It still happens.
But then the police will show up and say, oh yeah, my brother does this.
Yeah, can I get a picture? It's not that big of a deal.
So...
what else was different what about the shoes? Did you guys just wear tennis shoes?
Oh, that was one of the best things to change, I think, when in trying to make things more authentic is to see more authentic shoes. I mean, nothing's worse than you have pretty decent armor and then you have a pair of, basketball shoes on or whatever. We didn't have anything. Engineer boots were very common because they were thick and heavy. Hiking boots were common. But in terms of anything that actually looked medieval, that was for fighting. That was a long time later. Now, for costume, yes, people had made some semblance of shoes, but it took a while.
Oh, that's crazy. Very interesting. Very cool. What was your first officer position? Sounds like you had a lot of different positions in the SEA.
Yeah, I guess the first one would be
sheriff.
Being the sheriff. And that awesome. By the way, I had a clipboard and a pen, so it was official.
It was official, yes.
Yeah. After that, I was Knight Marshal. Then I was Earl Marshal. And that was kind of interesting being Earl Marshal in the very beginning, and then like 20 years later, I was Earl Marshal again.
So what does an Earl Marshal do?
In charge of the fighting in a kingdom. Their job is making sure that you follow the rules. They check armor and equipment, make sure it's relatively safe. So when we were a principality, we had a Knight Marshal, and then a kingdom has an Earl Marshal.
So how has that changed?
Well, for one thing, the biggest change, sometimes I've been asked, like, what's the best thing and the worst thing with the SCA today? And I say it's the same thing, it's the size. It's great that you can have events with thousands of people. I mean, we'd have a big event and have 30 people, 40 people. I was in a melee. We went up to California, a place called Tilden Park, and between the two kingdoms, they claim we put together 40 fighters.
Wow.
2 kingdoms to have 40 fighters, and everybody thought that's a big deal. All right, that's cool. On the other hand, there's so many people today, everything has become more compartmentalized. And I noticed that, like, baronies, sometimes people just kind of go to their baronial events. Whereas before, like, kingdom event, like, everybody in the whole kingdom basically would show up. But you have so many, more choices today. I mean, we'd have one event in 3 months, so you could spend all your time getting ready for the next event. Whereas today, you have 3 events on the same weekend in a kingdom, and it depends on how far you want to go. So it's great to see all the people that are there. It's great there are enough people that pretty much anything you want to learn, somebody else is learning it too. So you're not on your own. On the other hand, it becomes a little bit less personal. I remember the feeling when I started to go to an event and I didn't know everybody at the event. Because at first, everybody knows everybody. So it just shows you that the thing is growing. And as it grows, you need more rules. The laws, we could get by with doing things you couldn't do today. We camp out and nobody was saying, well, where are the fire lanes, In fact, I remember at a Burrow Creek, which was kind of before Australia, standing outside the concrete bathrooms with a long line of people because there were no other toilet facilities. And I remember talking with people, at some point we're going to have to start renting porta-johns for these events. And that's kind of how things had to happen. And it's like, wow, this is so big, now we need to do this. So now pretty much everything you go to do in the society, what I find, there's already the guidebook, there's already rules, there's already somebody who has their laurel in it, and so both good and bad. with that.
Yeah.
But the size of it makes it very different. So I think people maybe focus in the smaller groups because it's easier than maybe you do know everybody, you know. But I think a well-running barony today is kind of what we used to call a kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I was king the second time, Atenveldt on the map went from the Colorado River all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The trouble was there weren't many people between those two boundaries, so it's filled in quite a bit.
Which is a good thing, but
Yes,
can be a,
sure it is.
yeah.
I would never want to suggest, by the way, that there were these good old days and everything was wonderful back then, and you know, today somehow it's less. It's the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
You guys have many more opportunities. You can learn more faster. You have, you know, I don't know, we were pioneers, I guess, in some manner.
The trailblazers.
Trailblazers.
Of the
we didn't
SCA.
know it. We were just having fun. Really.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another important point, is that the SCA was never planned. And I know when people look at that and the structure and they say, well, why didn't they do it this way or that way? You would be amazed at how many of the things that are traditions and, you know, now very important were just stuff people made up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they just thought, well, that would be fun. And I liked the movie The Warlord. It was years ago, Charlton Heston. So we watched it one night and said, let's have a Warlord tournament.
And that's where Warlord came
So we
from.
went out the next day and started at a Warlord tournament. So it's just, you just kind of did stuff.
That is crazy. That's awesome. So tell me about your heraldry. How did you choose it? How did you research it? What is your heraldry?
My heraldry is a gold lantern on a blue background. I chose it because I liked, there was a fellow Diogenes in ancient Greece, and he was looking for the honest man. And so I kind of like that idea of a light looking for things. My wife chose the candle that's inside the light. So hers is the candle that's inside the lantern. Heraldry has changed a lot. We didn't know a lot about it at first. Just like with fighting and armor, there were a lot of things people were all being told were true,
Mm-hmm.
that you find out later really weren't true. We thought they were. Okay. And it was kind of like that with heraldry, the idea of what you could do or not. A lot of people have heraldry from the early times that would never have passed today. It just kind of came in at first. So that's at first I was told that my lantern was not even medieval, so I had to fight it out, some letters back and forth to the heralds arguing that it was. Another thing I'll mention, I find today in the society, people often ask the question, well, like, what's your persona?
Mm-hmm.
And people have created, you know, I was a Norman knight and I lived here at this time period, and my father did this, and you have a whole story. Nothing wrong with it, but that didn't exist at first. We didn't do that. So I don't really have a persona.
Just went out and
I
fought.
don't think, I always would say I'm the same person one way or another. I many times felt more natural in my armor than I did in a suit and tie, but I don't think we had personas. I think it was just another reflection of you,
Mm-hmm.
who you were. I took the name Arthur of Lockehaven because of King Arthur, which growing up I read King Arthur books, and that's probably what got me started on it. And from John Locke.
Oh.
If you look at American government and where
Yeah.
the principles came from, second treatise on government. And so I just put the two together. At the very first event, we were told, you have to have some name. And I had nothing, and I just went, okay, Michael the Unshaven, because I had a beard. And that lasted one event because I didn't like that name. So I figured I better put some more thought to it.
Well, at least it didn't submit it to heraldry, so it was set in stone.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, over the years, we've learned a lot more than we used to know.
So next question. Was there a certain demo that you attended that stood out to you? Or volunteer event?
In the first years, I was pretty much, I think, at every demo that we did, lots of them. School demos, Boy Scouts, ASU. I mean, I just can't imagine how many we did. Here's one thing kind of interesting. I went with Michael Amoria for the first time that we wanted to use a City of Phoenix park, and it happened to be in Canto, where they've had fighter practices now for decades, literally decades. And they didn't know what this SCA thing was, so we talked to them, and then we got out our armor and we fought, and they looked at it and they said, nope, you can't use our park. We were turned down to use the Encano Park that now has traditionally been there for decades.
So where did
they
you
changed
guys...
their mind eventually, but
They changed their mind. Why'd they change their mind? Does anyone know?
I don't know. Something you could ask Michael Amoria. In the early days, remember, with a smaller number of people, our fighter practices tended to be in people's backyards. Rick Cook's, mine, other people. Demos often were, probably elementary school was probably the most common. I loved doing them because that got the name out. That got more people involved. And there are adults in the kingdom now who tell me, you know, you came out to that demo way back when, and that's, you know, ever since then I wanted to do this. So we did lots of demos.
So, I can imagine you've been to a lot of the Estrella Wars.
I went to all the early ones. I was out of the SCA for 10 years. Mm-hmm. My kids were little. Came back in. So I haven't been to all of them, but I remember the very first. Sometimes they call it the Invitational. And then it moved to Burrow Creek, and I went through all those. And then a few more back at Estrella, and then out in Florence and Schneff Farms, and you know.
Florence and Schneff Farms.
Yeah, back and forth. But you know, there was a time where the war fit neatly at Estrella Park, and then there was a time, and it got to the point where it just didn't anymore. It was too big.
Is there a favorite memory of Estrella 4?
I just always had so much fun sword fighting. Honestly, I don't have one single moment that I think of. It was a lot of fun all the time. I'll give you a moment, though, a favorite moment that leads into another question on there.
Okay.
At one time, the Salt River Project was letting us use their recreational room, they call it the Para Hall, to have indoor events. Okay, they were going to do, the Salt River Project, a film. It was called Viva a Zanjero. And if you don't know, a Zanjero was a guy who worked on the canals, getting the water into the fields. And Viva Zanjero, they were going to show all the interesting things that people did at Salt River Project. And Mike Reynolds was think of internal communications he was head of. So we had this event where they're going to come out and film us doing this, and we did, and it turned out kind of interesting. I have it on tape now. But when it was over, we didn't want to go home. Everybody's got their gear out. So they said, well, let's have an abduction. And that's what we always thought of as a good way to get a fight started. And I was the head of the brigands. We were the bad guys. And we were going to abduct somebody. So I looked around and saw the cutest girl I thought was there, and went over and asked her if she wouldn't mind being abducted. And she said she wouldn't mind. And I threw her over my shoulder, my armor, and marched off abducting her, starting the war. So now we've been married 43 years.
Is that how you guys met then? Is you abducted her?
Yep.
You'd never met her before?
We've talked about it. We were at the same event a couple times maybe, but we didn't know each other or talk to each other before that.
So it was an abduction of love.
An abduction. But I asked politely, just to be clear.
It was a polite abduction of love.
It was a polite abduction. But so that, and then that's another thing too. I mean, the SCA is friendships. That's really what it is.
Yeah.
The rest of it, sword fighting's fun. It's a hobby, you know. Making stuff is a lot of fun. I always enjoyed making armor. But fundamentally, in my opinion, the SCA is relationships with people. And, you know, you can have friends from 30, 40, 50 years ago that you're still friends with. And we all kind of grew up together. These people that all look old now, there was a time we were all young. Mm-hmm. And over the years, we've seen, you know, our children grow up and all that, but in some ways you're still that kid way back when that showed up at the tournament. It was a lot of fun. Enjoyed it.
Are there any other, you've talked to a few special people that you've met through it. Are there any others, or any other?
I think the SCA was fortunate in some of the people in Berkeley who were there when it started. Diana Paxton, a fellow named John DeCleese, did a lot of writing, and if you look at the really old Tournaments Illuminated, I have right from the beginning, I have a bunch of the old ones, I thought they did a very good job laying out what the society could be. Mm-hmm. And I think that was really essential, because those few publications kind of held us all together. They put together a fighting manual that was like this: how to make a sword, how to make a shield. Today it looks so simple, but that's all we had. You know, those drawings are what we had. So I think some of those people up in the West were people that you needed to have there to spread that vision of it. Because at first the SCA, and as you know, I'm sure, go back to May of '66, it wasn't the SCA. The SCA didn't even exist.
No.
But a lot of people saw it as fantasy. And one nice thing I think with the SCA is it's big enough that you can kind of carve out what you want. Personally, I was never into the fantasy. I didn't read a lot of fiction. I liked history. So I always kind of envisioned it more history-oriented, but it never really was. It was always a little bit more, you know, to the fantasy. So you have that. And I think down here, absolutely no question, Michael Amoria, Richard Ironsteed got this thing going. Many other people around. Arthur of Lockehaven did a huge amount when it came to the arts and playing music. Okay, but I think Mike and Rick really got it together. They were old guys. They were like 26, 27 years of age.
So they were really old.
They were the old men.
They were really old guys.
And they had some business sense, and they had real jobs. Many of us, like me, I was still in college, and they did things that we wouldn't have done on our own. But once they set the path, we all were there. You know, we'd show up and do it. So I think the original people you have around that idea when it first happens have had a huge impact on the SCA, and I can see some ways the SCA went, and I think of the personality of a person way back at the beginning, and I think their personality kind of drove it this way. People may not be aware of that, you know, why, but a lot of those stories you can trace it back to, that's when this guy and this guy, you know.
And that's where it came from.
And out here, we had a lot of, I thought, very talented, very, very smart, but also, I think it's fair to say in the SCA, a lot of people are a couple standard deviations away from the mean, you know, they're, which I find wonderful, because that's what I like. So you had very creative people. Some were doing music, some were doing fighting, doing different things. And that's the nice thing about it, is that you can find your little niche, and maybe your particular interest, you know, you do that, while other people are doing this and other people are doing that. I tended to spend most of my time sword fighting, because that's what I like the most.
So the last question is going to be, is there a funny story or a memory or something that doesn't fit into any other of these questions that you want to share? One of those, I can't believe this happened, there I was, kind of thing.
I guess there's so many of them, I almost hate to start trying to rattle them off, because there's so many things that are funny. I remember us fighting down in the Salt River bed, and my brother, Charles of the Jacks, has a complete harness of plate armor, and they were fighting, and he got killed and fell into a little creek. So he's kind of waddling around in the water, and Ivan comes up and says, something like, there's a dead tuna fish in the river and it's already in a can. So I just remember a lot of little things like that. We had a lot of fun. I think one thing different, since rules were not quite so embedded, you know, the SCA has become, in my opinion, very conservative. I think that's something it should look out for, because it didn't grow that way. It grew by being the opposite. And like, we would do things like, when Ironsteed was king, we would load into Michael Amoria's van. He had a big van, and put everybody in it, drive over to Rick Cook's house, and everybody would get out in the front yard, make a bunch of noise, and yell, "The king is a fink," from the Wizard of Id.
That's where that came from.
King is a fink! And then we'd all rush back into the van and shut, you know, the door and take off, which we all just laughed unbelievably. I don't know if everybody would take it humorously today. I don't know. Would some people be too upset, you know, saying the king is a fink? But it was certainly meant with humor and, you know, good grace. But there were a lot of things like that. At one of the early events, I was Prince. My mother had made me a costume and ended up looking like a jockey's outfit, because it was really bright silvery blue and bright silvery like gold, and it did look kind of like a jockey's jacket. And so I'm sitting on the throne there for being Prince, and people would come by, doo-dah, doo-dah, Camp Town race, you know. It was all just for fun, you know. We enjoyed it. People didn't take it too serious, I think. I don't know. A lot of funny things. Many of them are stories that don't sound funny now. You'd have to be there and see it, you know.
No, those things still go on.
I know. Oh, believe me.
Yeah.
Lord, I hope so.
It's one of the best parts.
Of course.
Some of the best memories.
Yeah, you're out having a good time, and for fighters, you fight all day, you come home and or come back to your camp, and everybody, I killed 10. How about you? I killed 20. Okay, that's great. How did we lose? Each one of us killed at least half their army. There's a lot of sea stories, you might say,
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
But that's fun.
Did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
Let me think for a second. Can you turn it off there for just a second? Let
Sure.
me think if there's something. Thought I'd add that I think one of the big benefits for the SCA is that you get to test out a lot of things in life. And I think a lot of people would probably agree with me. He said, career as a teacher for 40 years and other things. After being king in the SCA, nothing really surprised me. in education, business, politics, you name it. And I think the SCA is really good sort of boot camp for the rest of your life. That you get some responsibility, find out how difficult it can be to, get everything going in a certain direction. Find out how important it is to have other people supporting it. To me personally, the SCA, it was a lot of fun. But I think that's probably the biggest benefit, is that you get to learn a lot about yourself and about other people.
Great. Thank you so much.